I was going to say, can you tell that's one she knows by heart? Anyway, good morning. Glad you're here. We've continued our study in the book of Judges. This morning, maybe with this patriotic theme, I should have added an eagle to our title, but there's no eagles appearing in these two chapters. But we do have a lion, bees, foxes, and a donkey, which foxes doesn't sound like the plural for foxes. It is the plural, right, for foxes, multiple foxes. Anyway, Judges chapter 14 and 15 we're going to look at today. Last week we introduced the theme of Samson's parents and the Nazirite vow and their commitment to raise him. God said he was going to give them a son, and there's three parts of this vow which I want to review for us briefly this morning, and their commitment that they were going to raise him in this vow. First thing was that they were to have no contact with dead humans or animals. Second part of the vow, and I went back to look at it because I didn't remember it this way in my mind. Sometimes we remember things that aren't necessarily that way. But he wasn't to drink alcohol. You remember that part. But he wasn't even to have contact with grapes or the seeds or the skins. As I went back to look at it, so it's even more extensive than no alcohol. And finally, it wasn't supposed to cut his hair. And that's, of course, what we remember most about Samson. All of our Sunday school flannelgraphs pictured a long-haired Samson, right? Which, I don't know how old he was, but I'm just trying to think about how long his hair could have been at that point. But Samson is probably the most familiar judge to us from not only Sunday school, but the reason for that is probably because there are about those 4 chapters. We did one last week. We'll do 2 today, and then we'll do another one in a few weeks when I'm back. But today, like I said, we want to cover chapters 14 and 15 because there's a pattern of behavior that develops in Samson. And when we get to the end today, I'm going to say, here's what we need to remember about Samson moving forward. And today will set us up for the final 2 weeks on Samson. So let's start in chapter 14, verse 1. We're going to read probably all of this morning. Samson went down to Timnah, which is a Philistine city. You wouldn't know that without me telling you. And at Timnah, he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. And then he came up and told his father and mother. One of the things you should note in Judges, this just occurred to me, is when something is going up or down, up is always a good thing, down is always a bad thing. So we've seen it multiple times, I just didn't point it out to us. So he came up and told his father and mother, and he says this, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah, now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, she is right in my eyes. And you already can just sense by the tone here that this story is now taking a downward turn. When his parents begin to question him about this, are you sure there's not an Israelite woman? This could also have been considered, most of the tribe of Israel was considered to marry some from other tribes anyway, rather than outside. Like he's already breaking one of the major rules for all of Israelites to marry a Philistine. Someone has noted about this passage that one of the reasons that she may have been attractive to him, and archaeology would tell us this as well, one of the things that we have in our mind, probably one of the things that we did as children, was we think of Israelites as the developed people. And in most cases, that can be true, but in the case of the Philistines, that is not true at all. The Philistines were far more developed technologically than the Israelites were. So he may have gone to this up-and-coming big city and realized all the technology and the things that they have. Let me just give you an example. You can write this reference down. 1 Samuel 13. If you read verses 19 through 22 in 1 Samuel 13, you'll see that the Philistines prevented blacksmiths from going to Israel because they didn't want them to have weapons, because they had mastered the idea of metalsmithing and ironworks and so forth. And Israel didn't have that. And it makes that clear to us in 1 Samuel 13. So the Philistines are more technologically capable and advanced than the Israelites, and maybe that was what attracted him to her. Maybe he's just a man with a wandering eye and a lustful heart or whatever. We don't really know, but he nevertheless says to his parents, get her for me. This is not a question. And his parents just begin to question him, and can't you almost hear the sadness in their voice with that question? Isn't there anyone else? And even by his demand, their hearts are broken and their hearts are crushed. Kind of what we went back to, we talked about this a little bit last week. One other thing that I want to mention to us, by the way, that I've been saving this for this whole time, that I never realized this, as we talk about the Philistines, one of the interesting things I learned about this is that the Philistines were not native to Canaan. They were not As we talked about the other Canaanites, they had come down from, I think, in the Greece area, and they lived along the coast. But one of the things that persists today is that their involvement and living in that region is where the modern name Palestine came from. I did not realize that until I was doing the study. Perhaps I'm just foolish for that, but Philistine and Palestine are related in their syntax and in the word origin. So that's where that name for modern day term Palestine comes, is from Philistines. Now we don't want to equate the Philistines' lifestyle with Palestine, but keep that in mind. So we can move on to the next verse. Verse 4, his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. He, there is God, was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. So Samson makes what we could consider an ungodly or an unholy request of his parents. And even though he does that, God's going to use it to accomplish his mission. It turns out that God had plans for it that his parents didn't know about. And that doesn't necessarily mean that this is God's approval. There was probably many other ways that God would have preferred to accomplish this. But this is an opportunity for God to act. And I want to just jump off here for a second. Thank goodness that God sometimes uses us despite our weaknesses and our own mistakes. And God's people said, amen. We've all been in those places where we did something that we felt terrible about and realized that, you know what, God's still going to get us through this. He's going to still be sovereign. So many times, hopefully you've realized this in your own life, that God will get you to that shore regardless of the choices that you make. It doesn't justify the choices that we always make, but it always proves to us that God is still sovereign. He's still able to accomplish his work despite our foolish choices or our sinful habits or selfish desires, as is the case of Samson here. Now, one of the things you need to note in that verse right there, it says at the very last part of verse 4 that the Philistines ruled over Israel. Now, that's something we haven't seen before. It said that they were oppressed, but at this point, they are now ruling over Israel. And we're going to see later that Israel is probably completely subject to them and okay with that idea. Verse 5, then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. Anything we should be curious about there? Why is he in a vineyard? He's courting temptation, isn't he? Here's a Nazirite who's not supposed to be around grapes or drink them or the seeds or the skins, and yet somehow the author sees fit to tell us there's vineyards where he is. And behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. Whether it's judgment for the vineyards or not, I don't know. But the thing is that Samson should not be here. Now what we're going to notice through the rest of this story, here's the first appearance of a lion, our first animal of the four that we're going to see this morning. We're going to notice throughout these chapters that Samson is a man of the wild. Hopefully, even from Sunday school, you picked that up, that he was a rugged outdoorsman, with long hair and all that. And you'll see his interaction with nature, that he's very accustomed to probably sleeping outside and living outside and doing all those sorts of things. We should probably know, you probably know this, he was no friend of PETA or the ASPCA, based on what's going to happen with the rest of our animals here. Verse 6, then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. Now, tearing the lion in pieces is one thing, but the second part of this, as one tears a young goat, I don't remember ever in my lifetime doing that. So maybe this is something that's cultural significant for those who were doing it then, but anyway, and it says, as he does this, he tears his lions in pieces, but he did not tell his father or his mother. Now, this part of, nobody has an explanation for me. How is he with his parents and fights a lion, and they don't see it or know it or hear about it, and he doesn't tell them? So what, maybe they went around the corner, maybe he chased the lion or fought it and they tumbled somewhere that the parents couldn't see, but they at least knew that there was some kind of a lion there, so I don't know how this happens, that his parents don't know about this. Then, verse 7, then he went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in whose eyes? In Samson's eyes. We come across this theme again in the book of Judges. Everyone does what is right in their own eyes. We're going to see it with Samson, and his eyes are wandering. We've talked about that. First thing to note here is that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. This happens with Samson more than any other judge. In fact, it's going to happen 3 times in these 2 chapters. For every other judge, the most was 1 time. So the Spirit of the Lord is at times involved in Samson's life. Verse 8, after some days, after when he went down to see the woman, after some days he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. Now this is where the part as a child where you start to go, wow, that's a really cool story, right? In Sunday school. And one of the commentators began to say that this is now an illustration of how fruitful the land of Israel was. They don't know how much time has passed. All of a sudden, there's honey where the death came from, and sweetness can flow. And we're going to see there's maybe even a theme that the author's portraying for us here. But on his journey, his return journey, the lion is now a beehive. Verse 9, he scraped it out into his hands and went on, eating as he went. Anything else wrong we should note there? It's a dead lion. He's not supposed to touch dead things. He's been in the vineyard, his eyes are wandering, and now he's touched a dead lion. And he came to his father and mother and gave some to them. What's wrong with this for the normal Israelites? This is unclean food for any Israelite. Forget the Nazirite vow. You're not supposed to eat anything that has touched a dead animal, and this is unclean. So now he has not only corrupted himself by his wandering eye, he has now involved his parents in this scenario without telling them where the honey came from. And he has now involved other people, including his parents, who he apparently still has some affection for, we'll see later. And they ate it, but he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. So now he's broken two parts of the vow. The only thing I can think of is maybe as he's doing this, he's planting this trump card against his parents because he knows they don't like the daughter, and they're going to say, well, she's unclean. And he say, well, you're too. You ate that honey, even though I didn't tell you where it came from. Maybe that's just a trump card that he has to play. Who knows really what he's thinking? And he says, if they persist in protesting this marriage to the Philistine woman, he's going to say, well, you're not so clean yourself. Verse 10, his father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. Now there's something more going on there that just doesn't come across in English. Samson prepared a feast there. The word feast comes from the verb to drink. And then interesting enough, in English, the phrase comes across pretty clearly as the young men used to do. What do young men used to do in preparing for a wedding feast? They drink. It's kind of implying that Samson is taking part in alcohol and breaking part of his Nazirite vow clearly now, not just in the vineyards, but by having this feast. Verse 11, as soon as the people saw him, very interestingly, they brought 30 companions to be with him. Apparently he doesn't have friends of his own. And Samson said to them, let me now put a riddle to you. Now, I don't know if this is part of a traditional wedding thing that the groom throws out a riddle to them or not. We're not clear on what was going on, but perhaps that's something that they normally did. And Samson said to them, let me put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. Verse 13, but if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. And they said to him, put your riddle that we may hear it. And he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. And now we know why the lion story is there, because it has to do with a riddle. Clearly he has this lion carcass and the beehive on his mind. And of course, and in 3 days they could not solve the riddle. Now, there's some cleverness in the Hebrew and some sophistication to this riddle, although let's admit this is entirely unfair. Never in the recorded history of man, other than this occasion, have we heard about a lion's carcass housing a beehive. And Samson decides, well, you should be able to get the answer to this riddle. Come on now, that's not fair at all. And it's nearly impossible to know the answer. There's no way that they can solve this riddle. So it's thought that he's already trying to provoke these people. These 30 friends that they brought in were likely not his friends, but a Philistine watch guard. Now, he's not done anything completely destructive that we know of to the Philistines, but they are already aware of his presence and have sent a bodyguard to his wedding now that he's in the city of Timnah, this Philistine city, to keep an eye on him. And as he tells this joke, what came to my mind is kind of like a little kid who comes up with a joke that's not funny at all, but he thinks it is, and just keeps laughing all day about it, telling the same joke. And you're like, okay, that's funny, and maybe you've humored your children and grandchildren with a joke that's just not funny that they think it is. That's kind of what comes across by the tone of this. And Samson, on several occasions, not just here, but he likes to tell riddles and poems, and he just kind of, like, I'm not just some strong, dumb guy, I'm smart too, He's trying to prove a point there. And we lose a lot of the things that happen in English, we lose a lot of the things that happen in Hebrew. But there's kind of maybe a foreshadowing of that despite sweetness, the honey is going to conquer, that's going to overcome his strength. And we know that's what happens in the life of Samson, especially in chapter 16. Verse 15, on the 4th day they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? Now, clearly, she's under threat. Now, this is not the first time in the book of Judges that we've seen women put in awkward and poor positions. Yet here's another one. Verse 16, and Samson's wife wept over him and said, "You only hate me. You do not love me. You've put a..." How manipulative is that? You have put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is. Now, I don't know how foolish Samson is, but isn't it pretty clear what's going on here? It should be for most of us. I mean, we know how the story goes. And he said to her, "Behold, I have not even told," the word even doesn't appear there, "I have not told my father nor my mother, and shall I tell you?" He is implying that if I didn't tell my parents, why should I tell you? He is still attached or paying reverence to his parents above her. He still values their opinion, even though he doesn't listen to them about finding another woman outside of Philistine. So, of course, she entices him to tell her this answer under the threat of violence from what we're told are companions, these 30 companions. So now they have threatened her life. And we realize that in her manipulation, there's a little foreshadowing of that woman that we're all familiar with, Delilah, in chapter 16, right? Almost the same story. You see, when we read Scripture as literature and we understand how stories are told, we understand what the authors are doing, he's setting us up for what's going to happen in the next chapter. One of the other questions I had is he has to recognize what she's doing, unless he is perhaps as dense as his father was that we saw in the last chapter. Remember, his dad was like foolish about, "Oh, the Lord's going to kill us," when the angel of the Lord showed up. And the wife is like, "Well, he's not going to kill us. He has a plan for us," right? Remember how dense we thought Manoah was at that point? Unless he's got some of that gene from his father, he's got to know what's going on. Unless he's just purely blinded by his desire and his lust for this woman. So he hasn't told his parents. Verse 17. So this continues on. She wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted. And on the 7th day he told her, because she pressed him hard. Then she told the riddle to her people. Now, she's just trying to preserve her own life, right? She's under threat of death, and she's just doing what she can. Because really, in the scope of 30 garments of clothing versus my life, I think I want to choose my life as well. And the men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" And he's got to know in that instant exactly what happened. And the Scripture would seem to tell us it does. And he said to them, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." Now, this sounds like some kind of country cliche, doesn't it? And it really, it's in English, it comes across pretty well. He's a little bit vulgar here is what he's being about. When he says, "You plowed with my heifer," he's obviously talking about his wife. There's some sexual innuendo and connotations going on here, especially in the Hebrew. But he says, "You stole this from my wife," and he's a little bitter about that. So they give him this answer. And like I said, it's just as crude in Hebrew as it is in English. Verse 19. So what happens then when they solve his riddle? "And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him." Second time. "And he went down to Ashkelon," another Philistine city, "and struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle." Those guys had nothing to do with any of this. You see how this is beginning to stir up this enmity between Samson and the Philistines. First it's a woman, then we bring in 30 Philistines, and now Samson's going to kill another 30 Philistines guys to pay off his 30 companions at the wedding. "And he gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house." He's probably mad with his wife, right? And Samson's wife was given to his companion. Now, this is done by her father, we're going to see, who had been his best man. Probably not really his best man, just one of the 30 guys. So that finishes that chapter. We needed to note that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him to kill these 30 men. And I got to wonder at this point, does he know what has happened to his wife? I think he was just so angry he went back to live with his parents or something. And of course, chapter 15, verse 1 says, "After some days, at the time of wheat harvest," indicating a significant amount of time has probably passed, "Samson went to visit his wife," from this previous chapter, "with a young goat." He's going to make up, right? He's bringing her this young goat. "And he said, I will go into my wife in the chamber, but her father would not allow him to go in." Now, why is that? And her father said, "I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister," now he's trying to appease them at this point, "is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead." We've seen this before. Remember the case of Jacob and Rebekah and Leah and all that sort of stuff back in the book of Genesis? "And Samson said to them," this is not going to be enough for him. He says, "This time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines." Once again, the Philistines are going to pay for what his, I guess, ex-wife's father has now done to him. You'll see that, again, the author just keeps setting up this back and forth between the Philistines and Samson. He says, "This time I'll be innocent when I do them harm." My question became, so why punish the Philistines for what her father did? Well, because that's the point of the story. Verse 4. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches, and he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain as well as the olive orchard. So these foxes do a huge amount of damage. So this little tribal war between Samson and the Philistines has now escalated into economic warfare. He's now destroying standing grain, stacked grain, and also the field, the olive orchards that he had gone through earlier. Someone points out that he's now understanding the idea of economic terrorism. And certainly, from this point on, we're going to see that this destruction escalates the conflict between Samson and the Philistines. And there's no turning back from this. Verse 6, after the foxes are set through, it says, then the Philistines said, who has done this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. The whole thing that she tried to avoid from the beginning by not solving the riddle has now come upon her anyway. And the Philistines are now striking back at Samson. Apparently they think he still has some attachment to this woman, so they're going to kill her and her family. It's not going to bring back their crops, but at least I guess they'll feel some sort of relief or vengeance from that. Verse 7, and Samson said to them, if this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I will quit. And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Edom. So now it's just a smaller little battle going on. We realize his vengeance for killing his wife is he's going to kill more of them. Verse 9, then the Philistines, now they're going to strike back. They came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. And the men of Judah said to Samson, said to the people of Philistine, why have you come up against us? They said, the Philistines respond, we have come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us. They're just going back and forth. He did this, we're going to do that. Then verse 11, then 3,000 men of Judah, Israelites, went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? Again, showing us that they have completely subjected themselves as the Philistines as their rulers. What then is this that you have done to us? Why do you keep escalating this battle? And he said to them, just like every sibling would say, they did it to me first, right? As they did to me, so have I done to them. And it keeps going back and forth. And now the Philistines are hunting for him. The Israelites are going to send not just one or two, but 3,000 guys to go down and talk to Samson. Now I'm curious as to why at this point, if nobody knows about the lion story, are they sending 3,000 men? There's clearly more that has happened in the life of Samson that makes him an intimidating, powerful figure than the book of Judges tells us. Otherwise, what when we just send a couple guys and say, hey, why have you done this? And verse 12, and they said to him, we have come down to bind you that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves. They said to him, no, we'll only bind you and give you into their hands. We'll surely not kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. So they go to capture him. Of course, this 2 new ropes is also something that we're going to see again in chapter 16. The author is setting us up for that. It says, when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. They are eager to have him turned over to them, tied up. And what happens here in verse 14? Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. This is the third and actually the final time that it says the Spirit of the Lord is with Samson when he's defeating the Philistines here. Verse 15, what happens with this time is he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey and put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. And Samson said in his license and his poetic license, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey have I struck down 1,000 men. Now in Hebrew that's nothing like it is in English. It's not good, but he's reciting more poetry. He fancies himself a poet. He's not just a big smart guy. He likes to do poetry. And as soon, verse 17, as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramath Lehi. Now, we wouldn't get this in the English, again, but this idea of the jawbone is that this donkey is not old and decrepit. If you're able to fight with the jawbone of a donkey, it's somewhat fresh and sturdy and still strong. So this is a fairly fresh donkey's carcass, and once again, what has he done? He's broken his vow. Again, he's contacted a dead animal. So after he kills 1,000 of them, verse 18 says, and he was very thirsty, and he called upon the Lord and said, you have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant. And shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? In his mind, dying in the presence of the Philistines is the worst thing that can happen to him. Because he is so angry about this tribe. Verse 19, so what does God do? And God split open the hollow place that is Lehi. God's again providing for him. And water came out from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned and he revived. Therefore, the name of it was called En Hakkore. It is at Lehi to this day. So God miraculously provides this water after his thirst. And God is providing for him despite his disobedience, his failures, and his lust. And that's the 2 chapters. We've got one more verse left, but we'll get to that in a second. But it brings us to where we come every week to our conclusions and our questions and applications. One author has suggested that of Samson, he may be the most well-known, but he's also likely the worst. Because there's really not a whole lot of successes. Unless you consider killing people a successful venture, which is what God's plan was, everything else in his life has been lust and sin and uncleanness and unholiness. The things at the end of his life, we'll see in a few weeks, are no better than when they started. The Israelites are still subject to the Philistines. And then if you look at the 5 chapters after this chapter, they are much worse. Worse than you would possibly imagine. And Samson he's quite if you study all the background and the things that are going on in these 2 chapters, he's quite a complex character if we move beyond the Sunday school flannel graph. If we dig into his actions, we're often left with more questions about what is normal, what should have been happening, than we have answers. It's also odd here in verse 20 of that last chapter. It says that he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. We're used to when we seeing that, it means that's the end of the judge's story. But Samson, we know, has another chapter left. So one of the questions that I still have about this, and I don't know that any commentator can answer us for this, but when you think about the story of Samson, I guess my question is, was Samson ripped? Or the possibility is he looked like a normal guy with long hair, and when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, he is enabled to do supernatural things. I don't know the answer to that question, and you could probably defend either way. We know that at least in this chapter, when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, other than the story about the foxes, he does something supernatural. It doesn't say the Spirit of the Lord came upon him when he did the foxes' tails. It doesn't say that he was rushed on by the Spirit on every occasion of supernatural ability, but in this chapter it does. And all of his actions with animals result in death, right? He kills a lion, he steals the honey from the bees. The foxes almost certainly died as their tails were set on fire. And he kills the Philistines with a dead donkey's jaw. And while those feats are not ordinary, what happens in the next chapter is certainly extraordinary. So I wanted to give us this morning 3 things to remember when we return to Samson in a couple weeks in chapter 16. First off, Samson never raised an army, right? There's no one on his side. It's just Samson versus the Philistines, and there's this constant back and back, and it seems like it's come down to a smaller scale, whereas other judges would rise up and raise an army and fight and deliver themselves from whoever it was. Samson's just like this little back and forth thing between him and the Philistines. He never raises an army. And really what this story is focused on, as we saw on our way through it, is it's really focused on his relationship with this vow that he's taken. And we've seen just in this chapter, he's already broken it on more than one occasion. And there's only one thing left for him. The second thing I want us to remember is not just the back and forth between the Philistines and Samson, is obviously it's going to come into play in the next chapter, is his appetite for women. There's only one in this chapter, but in the next chapter there are 2. And one of them you'll be familiar with. But this idea shows a pattern in Samson's life, and his marriage shows a pattern of being manipulated by women. There are at least 3 examples of 3 women that Samson desired. Remember what it said about her? She was right in his eyes. He's just Twitter-pated was the word. Is that a real word? Is that from Bambi? Maybe it's a college word that we made up. We would describe a guy in college that was falling in love with some girl. We would call him Twitter-pated. I don't know why I'm thinking that word. But he's enamored. He's falling in love with these women, or he's at least lusting after them. And they use that to manipulate him. Already in this chapter and again in the next. And as strong as he was physically, as we've started to see, he was also that weak morally, despite the fact that he had taken this Nazirite vow. And Samson is often controlled by his impulses. The woman, the lion, the honey. He says to his parents, get her for me, right? He just says, oh, there's some honey in the line. I think I'll go take that. Not even thinking about his vow. It doesn't show any reflection as he does that. And what suffers because of his impulses are his vows and his morals and his purpose, and ultimately his life is going to be forfeit. So that's two things. The third thing I would have us to remember as we come back to this in a few weeks is notice this conflict with the Philistines, but also the phrase Spirit of the Lord. I mentioned it happens 3 times in this chapter. Almost always to do with doing something supernatural. But we should notice that God's Spirit is not a constant presence in his life. The author points out to us when it happens. We can't just assume that the Spirit of the Lord was constantly guiding his every thought, right? And we're pretty sure that the Spirit of the Lord was not guiding his every thought and his every impulse based on what happens. But Samson, and the conclusion of our official Judges, receives the operations of the Spirit 4 times. And we saw the last one there in verse 14. So we could draw this conclusion today that while we assume that God's commissioning a deliverer and calling Samson and giving him and endowing him with the Spirit is a guarantee of the individual's upright behavior and his exemplary life, that is not necessarily so. And you're going to see where I'm going with this in a second. From Othniel, our first judge, to Samson, several of the judges are empowered by God and endued by the Spirit, yet there is a progressive and inexorable deterioration of behavior and of their morality, despite God's intervention. So I would conclude and say that and apply it to ourselves this way as we start to wrap up this chapter. Samson continues to do extraordinary things that we're going to see in the next chapter. He continues to pray as he did there when he was thirsty. Remember, he prayed and God provided some water for him. And he's going to continue to win battles. But now the Spirit of the Lord has been with him for the last time. In fact, in the next chapter, verse 20 of chapter 16, it says, but he did not know that the Lord had left him. So despite his victories and the things that are going on good around him, the Spirit of the Lord is no longer with him. And he is unaware of it. So I would use that to conclude and apply to our lives this morning. We cannot assume that the apparent blessings of our lives mean that we are right with God. In fact, I think in Samson's case, we have to assume that God was using him despite himself. And that's kind of that clue that we got from the first verse, that even his parents didn't know that God had intended to do this. But because of his wandering eye and the breaking of his vow, his dishonoring his parents with unclean food, they are certainly clues to his moral state. I was just thinking of someone this week from a position of spiritual leadership who just seems to be, even though despite things on the outside may seem to be good, has a position of just foolishness and pride. And I look back at it now and I go, well, things looked really good and it looked like it was going so well. And yet on the inside there was this state of pride and things that could not be overcome, that God was using the person despite of themselves. I don't want us to become that person. To go along and coast along because things are going so well. We live in a country, we've celebrated today, that is very blessed and very fortunate to have a lot of things. Materially, physically, freedom, you name it. We've been blessed with a lot of things. That doesn't mean that we are sold out to God 100% of the time. We need to be cautious and remind ourselves that we could fall under Samson syndrome. Looks like it's going good, but it's really not. And I think the point for us again today is that it is dangerous for us to assume that because everything seems to be going well on the outside, that we are in good standing in our relationship with God. This is a danger for both believers and unbelievers. Too often, so many in our world will not turn to Christ without some crisis in their life. I've talked about this before, that often God has to use supernatural, unwanted circumstances to get people to pay attention to his voice. It would be well for all of humanity, Christians and unchristians, to stop and reflect on their spiritual life, regardless of the circumstances and the nature of things around us. So let me conclude with this question this morning. Is the blessing of our life a result of our walk with God or in spite of it? And only you can answer that question. So we'll conclude with that thought as we close in prayer this morning. Father, we come to your word We look at this story, we are challenged by these tremendous feats that Samson accomplished, things that he did, and yet we are tormented by the seeming disregard for your word and your truth and what you've called him to do. And we are cautioned in our own lives about what that might look like. Lord, we don't want to take for granted the many blessings we have in this country. We are so thankful for those who fought to bring us this freedom, material prosperity, those who have worked so hard for so many years. And we are enjoying that blessing, Lord, but help us to be mindful that it's not because of them, but it's because of, that's the most important thing, is because of our relationship with you. If there's someone here this morning who has been challenged by that, Lord, draw them to you in that moment and remind them that you are always good and faithful and true and merciful and bringing forgiveness and compassion. And let us again open up our hearts to hear what your Spirit would say to us, so that, as in the case of Samson, so the Spirit of you is not just a once in a while thing, but is a constant presence in our life. Lord, help us to dwell in your Spirit. Help us to heed the challenge of Paul that wrote to the book of 2 Corinthians. Examine yourselves to see if your faith is genuine. Test yourselves. Surely you know that Jesus Christ is among you. If not, you have failed the test of genuine faith. Lord, help us all to be found true and faithful. And God's people said, amen. God bless you. Have a great week.